All right, let's jump right in. You know the story we're all taught about the Middle Ages, right? The idea that after Rome fell, Europe plunged into 1,000 years of darkness and decline. But what if that's not the whole story? What if we're missing a massive piece of the puzzle? Today, we're digging into the argument from historian Thomas E. Woods Jr., who says the Catholic Church wasn't holding civilization back, it was actually building it. And the source material comes out swinging with this quote. The point here is that this popular idea of a dark age filled with ignorance and superstition, well, most professional historians today just don't buy it. It kind of sets up the big question for us. If the Dark Ages weren't so dark, then what was really going on? And this slide just lays out the whole argument in a nutshell. On one side, you have the myth, intellectual barrenness, scientific repression, chaos. But the source flips every single one of those on its head. It argues that instead of barrenness, you get the birth of the university. Instead of repression, you get the framework for science. And instead of chaos, you get the very foundations of Western law. Let's see how they make that case. So to really get what the church was up against, you first have to picture what Europe was like back then. And look, the conventional story isn't totally wrong about this part. After the Roman Empire crumbled, things got messy. Europe was thrown into a really unstable and, frankly, chaotic period. The barbarian invasions really did bring chaos. Literacy just plummeted. Think about it. All that knowledge from the ancient world was suddenly at risk of just vanishing. Political order was a memory, and rational Roman law, it got replaced by things like trial by ordeal, where you'd find out if someone was guilty by seeing if they survived being thrown in boiling water. It was a world teetering right on the edge of losing its entire civilizational memory. So, how was all that knowledge saved? This is where the story takes a turn. The argument is that one institution didn't just survive the storm, it actually stood like a fortress against the chaos, and it began the massive job of preserving and rebuilding. And that brings us to the monks. Now, we all kind of know they copied books, right? But according to the source, what they did was so much bigger than that. They were these little islands of literacy in a giant ocean of illiteracy. They taught practical things, like better ways to farm. The monasteries weren't just hiding from the world. They were centers of order and learning. In a world that was falling apart, they were busy putting the pieces back together. And this quote man, it really brings it home. This isn't some modern reflection. This was written by a monk on an actual manuscript he was copying. It's a reminder of the sheer physical work, the exhausting labor it took to save Western literature. Imagine sitting in a cold room with just 3 fingers holding a pen and your whole body just aches. That's dedication. And this whole project of saving knowledge wasn't just about preserving the past, it led to something brand new. The source shows this clear line from the schools and the monasteries and cathedrals to an invention that changed the world, the university. And this was a uniquely Western Catholic creation. Popes would grant them charters, which protected them and, this is huge, made their degrees valid everywhere. It created the first real international community of scholars. I mean, when you boil it all down, this quote from the source really says it all. In a time of constant war and instability, the church is presented as the only game in town, the only institution that cared enough and had the structure to actually preserve and cultivate knowledge. Okay, so saving old books is one thing, but the source goes even further. It argues the church also nurtured a whole new way of thinking, one that actually paved the way for modern science and modern law. And right on cue, here's the elephant in the room, the question everyone asks. But what about Galileo? The source doesn't shy away from this. It tackles the Galileo affair head-on, basically saying that it's the famous exception that actually proves the rule, and that the story we all know is a lot more complicated than we think. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. This quote is from Cardinal Bellarmine, a major figure in the Galileo case. And look what he's saying. He's saying that if there were real proof, they'd have to reconsider how they interpret scripture. The source uses this to show that the mindset wasn't necessarily science is wrong, but more like show us the proof. It suggests a door that wasn't completely shut to science. And the core of the argument is this. Science didn't happen to spite the church, but because of a specific Christian idea, the belief that God created a rational, orderly universe that follows predictable laws. Think about it. If you believe the universe is just random and chaotic, why would you even bother looking for the laws of nature? This theological idea gave people a reason to believe those laws were there to be discovered. And this idea of a rational order wasn't just for studying the stars, it was for human society too. The source points to the church's own legal system, canon law, as the first modern legal system in Europe. It took this messy jumble of local customs and old traditions and organized it all into a single, coherent, rational system. It basically provided the blueprint for the modern state. Okay, get ready for this, because this is a really provocative claim. We usually think the idea of rights comes from the Enlightenment, guys like John Locke. But the argument here is that the whole intellectual framework for uniformulated rights actually got its start way earlier, in the legal work of medieval church lawyers. And it doesn't even stop at law. The source makes the same case for economics. It even quotes the famous economist Joseph Schumpeter, who said that if you want to find the founders of modern economic science, you have to look at the Spanish theologians of the 15th and 16th centuries. Who would have thought? So, we've covered the mind, right? Law, science, the university. The argument now moves to its final and maybe its most important point: how the church shaped the very heart and soul of the West, especially with a revolutionary new idea about charity. And to understand just how these new moral ideas could spread, you have to appreciate the kind of influence we're talking about. Just look at this number, 24. By the early 1300s, just one monastic order, the Benedictines, had produced 24 popes. That shows you how the values being taught in these monasteries were being broadcast from the very highest levels of society. You know, a quote is powerful when it comes from an enemy. Julian the Apostate was a Roman emperor who was actively trying to crush Christianity. And even he had to admit, almost in frustration, that this Christian charity thing was just unstoppable. They weren't just feeding their own people, they were feeding the pagans too. And it was so attractive, so radical, it was winning people over. And this chart just lays out the difference perfectly. In the ancient world, giving was often for show, to get your name on a building. It was for people who deserved it. The church, the source argues, introduced something totally new: charity done for the love of God, not for public acclaim. And it was for everyone in need, even your enemies, as a core moral duty. That's a game changer. And this new moral compass had huge real-world consequences. The source directly credits the church's influence with ending practices that had been common for centuries, things like abandoning unwanted infants and the brutal gladiatorial games. At its core was this new, radical idea that every single human life is sacred and has dignity. So, to wrap it all up, the argument we've been looking at today is that whether you're talking about the university, the foundations of law, the philosophical groundwork for science, or a revolution in charity and morality, the Catholic Church wasn't a bystander or an obstacle. It was, the source claims, the indispensable architect of Western civilization. And that really leaves us with a final, big question to think about. If this historical account is true or even partially true, it really challenges the way many of us think about our own history. It makes you wonder, what else have we forgotten about the very foundations of the world we live in today?